Please welcome with me Trevor Jolson.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Welcome to Texas, everyone. It's great to see you here. Quick show of hands, who came in from California? Can I see some hands raised? I want to encourage all of you to have a very good time here in the great state. However, don't get too comfy. There's been too many of you moving here, and you are taking all of our reasonable housing, and you are congesting our streets, and we are tired of it. So please make sure you make your flight back home, but have a great time at this conference. Quick personal introduction. So Trevor Jolson, I am with Trane Technologies, and I lead our key account decarbonization program. So we work with large corporate customers that have an ambition to reduce emissions within their built environment, and we help them with strategy and then ultimately how they're going to go about decarbonizing their business. I'm based out of Dallas, Texas, so it was just a short flight via Southwest Airlines to get down here. Been home for me for about a decade now, so proud Texan, and I really do welcome all of you to the state, and thank you for hosting it here. So a little bit of the genesis of this presentation and why the Trane organization has decided to present on this topic and how we went about building it. About 2 years ago, we started to get a lot of unsolicited outreach from two different stakeholder organizations. The first was our executives were getting contacted by their peers. And what their peers were telling them is, hey, we see Trane Technologies out front as a leader in decarbonization. We see the awards you're getting, and we want to find ourselves in that same situation. Can you help us? So our executives kind of took notice of that and saw an opportunity that we could lean into. So we're going to talk a little bit about exactly how you go about establishing a decarbonization strategy and program and some of the basic blocking and tackling. But you'll see the tagline on here, which hopefully catches your interest a little bit. Why do investors want to buy you HVAC? And then you can put in parentheses and other things. So second opportunity to raise your hands. Who has been approached at your door by a solar developer before, and they're looking to sell you solar? I see a few hands raised going up. It's always an interesting conversation, right? It's the 23-year-old that's fresh out of school, got a fresh haircut, a nice polo from the solar developer, some Banana Republic khakis. They're feeling not too confident in themselves as they hold their iPad, but their whole pitch is, we'll give you solar and you don't have to pay anything. We'll just give it to you. We're going to put it on your roof. It's not going to cost you. You're going to make money. Well, there's some complexities to that, especially at the residential level. However, as you start to scale in operations and in C&I space, there's some realities to that. So we're going to talk about how that financial pitch and structure works in the data center space in particular. And ultimately, what we're going to build towards is, why is decarbonization, why is high efficiency HVAC, solar, and some of the other technologies we're going to talk about, why is it a good investment? And we're going to build that investment case. So if you came in here and you thought it was going to be a little bit more on the technical side, or we were going to do some tree hugging, that's not where we're going to go. We're going to talk about where the money is at in decarbonization and why it has been such a change and is on the tip of the tongue. You walk past those booths, and it seems like half of the companies now are using ESG, sustainability, or decarbonization as their lead. So we're going to make it crystal clear why there's a business case for it. So this slide here is one that we actually built for our own organization. And what we realized is there was a lot of confusion in the words that I just shared with you and how they were being used out there. Everyone was saying sustainability and ESG and decarbonization and electrification, and they were using it in an inappropriate context. So I like to kick off all of these sessions with this waterfall slide that walks through the different word choices and helps make sure that we all have a shared grounding on the appropriate word choice. So at the top of this waterfall is sustainability. Now we see that from corporations called ESG. And that's an acronym that breaks down for environmental, social, and governance. The darker shade of red is where we're going to focus our conversation today. And as you go into environmental, there's sustainability attributes that are around climate change, pollutions and resources, water security, and biodiversity. But we're going to focus on the climate change and pollution and resources, which is where is most prevalent to the data center space, although the others can still be critical. So you break that down into 3 different emission scopes, and we're going to go a little bit deeper into these throughout the presentation. But you have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And those have scope components to them. So your scope 1 emissions are those that have an emission that is used directly within your operations on site. It's typically the fossil fuels that are used at a data center. A great example of a scope 1 emission is going to be the natural gas or diesel that you're using in your backup generation. I know that's a hot topic throughout this conference to talk about alternatives, and we'll talk through it a little bit as well. Another lesser known and something that's near and dear to us is actually refrigerants. So the refrigerants that you're using in your chillers and any losses of that refrigerant are a scope 1 emission that you are accountable for. Now, scope 2 emissions are all of the electricity that you take into your operations. Obviously, we're here with a very energy-intensive industry and specifically electricity-intensive industry. So scope 2 emissions are right in the scope of focus, pun intended on that one. And then scope 3 is everything else that sits within a customer's value chain. And it's really interesting for this audience in particular because it falls to your customers. If you're working in a co-location type of setting, you are operating as a customer's scope 3 emissions. So you'll start to see more and more your customers leaning into you to drive decarbonization to help them achieve your goals, or achieve their goals. Let's correct that one. But actually, it doesn't need a correction because they're meant to be the same. And I think that's an important takeaway from this slide, but I'll correct that. It's not I think, it is an important takeaway from this slide. Your scope 1 and 2 emissions within your own operations are someone else's scope 3 emissions. And you are going to continue to hear more and more challenging to reduce your scope 1 and 2 emissions so that you can help your customers achieve their goals. So you add all those up and ultimately you're getting to a corporation's carbon footprint and what they are going to communicate out to the street upon. But what we're focused on is solutions and how can we actually solve for these emissions. And the solutions we're going to walk through further here, but what I want everyone to walk away with is that the solutions are decarbonization. So we're going to use the word decarbonization because it's an active term. It's a term focused on actually driving solutions into the built environment and into your operations to reduce emissions. This is a slide. I'm not seeing a lot of cameras out and taking pictures, so maybe I'm not doing a good job explaining this one. This is normally when everyone's like, I'm going to steal that slide from you, but there's other good slides, I promise. So maybe in the future, you're welcome to do it, but there's a copy of it as well. So this is another one of my favorite slides to describe energy decarbonization, make sure that the message is landing. The map that you are looking at is called the E-Grid map. It comes from the Department of Energy here in the United States. The darker the shaded blue area, the higher the emissions of the local electricity grid. The lighter the area, the less emissions from the electricity grid. So we're talking about scope 2 emissions here. And if you are a data center operator with facilities distributed across the United States, the crux of this is that the electricity that you're taking from the grid, the emissions intensity of it is out of your control. That's why it's a scope 2 emission. So if you're looking at these distributed facilities, you have to make business decisions based on the emissions intensity of that electric grid. So if you have a data center that's operating in Detroit, Michigan, as an example, every kilowatt hour you can save is going to have a greater decarbonization impact than the kilowatt hour you save in Los Angeles, California, as an example. All right, so let's talk about why energy decarbonization. Why has this become such a focus for businesses? The first is the oldest, it's reducing operational cost. If we can decarbonize, we are going to be reducing our operational need, and thus we're reducing our OpEx for our business. The second is creating shareholder and brand equity, and we're gonna go into that further, but you're seeing so many corporations lean into this to really ingrain themselves with their main stakeholders through a decarbonization strategy. The third, in my opinion, is the most important, which is removing business risk. We are in an industry which is certainly not a stranger to business risk. We are all very conscious of the risk of something like extreme weather events. So when you look at climate change and you look at the potential for increased extreme weather events, it's easy to draw the correlation from the cost of your operations to build resilience into it in the increase of risk that could come from extreme weather events. So when you're looking at your business and coming up with a risk mitigation plan, if you're looking at scenarios where we are not decarbonizing as a society, you are carrying some significant risk on your books. To give you another example, who is from or runs a data center that's in New York City? Anyone? Someone from the big city back in the left? So, example of business risk that's coming as well. In New York City, there is a regulation that is called Local Law 97. How Local Law 97 operates is it puts a cap on the amount of emissions that every building can be responsible for from a baseline that was established. Anyone that overdrives that cap is going to get hit with you can call it a tax, you can call it a fine, whatever you want to call it, but it is a significant fine that is coming down on that business. I think we're probably all familiar with the fact, I called out California already, but New York is the other example. When that city moves, you're starting to see the crystal ball into the future of how things could operate as we go forward. So you're seeing local jurisdictions set these carbon price caps. And now in the future, if you are a heavy emissions intensity type of corporation, you could have a huge risk on your books to operate in these major metropolitan areas. All right, absolute favorite slide, we're doing it. Raise of hands, who's familiar with the CDP? Good, y'all are gonna learn something today. This is good, I like that hand raise though, that was a confident one. But CDP stands for Carbon Disclosure Project. And the chart that you are looking at on the screen, the hockey stick, the numbers aren't all that important, but the growth is. So last year, 13,126 companies voluntarily disclosed their emissions to the CDP, which is the gold standard for voluntary emissions disclosure. You go back to 2005, and you're at just about 1,000. So we are seeing this stark uptick in corporations that are going in a voluntary fashion and telling the world what their emissions are and telling the world what their plan is to decarbonize. Of the 13,126 companies last year that filed their emissions publicly, 200 of them were given an A. It's part of what makes the CDP so interesting. Everyone that discloses their emissions is given a grade. If you disclose, you are going to get an A through a D. If you are asked to disclose and choose not to, like Tesla is actually a great example of a company that has been asked to disclose and has not done it yet, you receive an F. And this is all publicly available information. So it creates this really competitive environment, and it almost gamifies decarbonization for these corporations. And we've seen it firsthand with the companies that we work with. There are many of them that come to us and say, we got a C on our CDP report last year, and our CEO was embarrassed, and he said, or she said, we are going to fix that, and we are going to take action right now. So this very public forum of disclosure and grading has created this environment of competition and action. And one of the reasons why is that statistic you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen, which is the companies that have A ratings. When you look at the ones from last year, they have outperformed all other companies 5.8% per annum on the stock market over the last decade. So there is a correlation to be drawn between the companies that are leaders in decarbonization and the companies that are performing on the stock market. And I added this on the flight over, and the team was welcoming enough to get it updated. Just released last week, 17,890 is the new number. So when you're thinking about a hockey stick chart, and I was already showing it to you at 13,000, this last week we know the new number is 17,890 companies voluntarily disclosing. It's worth calling out while we're on this slide about disclosure that there is growing momentum from the SEC to move it from voluntary disclosure to involuntary disclosure. So all publicly traded companies in the future, there is a pretty clear crystal ball there that there will be an expectation to disclose your emissions with your filings. How small is it? It's kind of small. Hopefully you guys can follow it. So I want to double click into the why here. And I want to show you some kind of important background information as well. So we just talked about the CDP, and most of the room wasn't familiar with it. But if you Google or Bing or whatever companies here, I apologize if I offended you, but if you do that, the search engine.com, and you look up a company's stock, you now see their CDP score directly connected with that stock. The example there is Microsoft in the upper left-hand corner, and I do apologize, it's somewhat of an eye chart. But you can do it later if you like to play the stock market, if you're on Robinhood losing 25% of your value over the last year, or whatever it might be. Go do it when you get home. Google a company's stock, and you can see their CDP score right there, which says that it's a critical piece of investor information that's available. But beyond that, beyond the fact that we're connecting emissions performance to stock information, the absolute biggest driver, the reason that ESG and decarbonization is on the tip of everyone's tongue is because of the institutional investment community. The single loudest voice in that room is Larry Fink, who is the gentleman on the lower right-hand corner, who is the CEO of BlackRock. He has been the most vocal about the fact that the companies that they are invested in, they have an expectation going forward that those companies are going to establish a firm baseline for their emissions, and they are going to set a plan for decarbonization. So great, he has the mic and he's willing to talk up, but why does that matter? That's the other chart. Larry Fink and BlackRock own 6.9% of the Microsoft stock. The institutional investment community owns over 70% of Microsoft stock. So when these companies are coming out and they are setting expectations for change, the corporations that view them as their major stakeholders are going to change. They are going to take action. And all of the institutional investors, this is gonna be dangerous, we're gonna go backwards. We're doing it, okay, we did it. All of the institutional investors are focused on all of this. They're focused on removing business risk. And they're saying that they do not believe that companies that have significant emissions on their books as we move into 2030 and 2040 in a low carbon society can survive. That's what they're telling these corporations because they view it as such a significant risk. All right, in my role, I work with corporations across all different industries. It's not just the data center space, although we do work with a number of the hyperscalers and large colo providers. Over the last year and a half, probably talked to, I think the number is now 90 large corporations that we've talked about their decarbonization journey with them. We've synthesized that into 3 very distinct stages for where every corporation is at. The first is we're getting pressure from investors. Those stodgy investors found them and they started rattling their cages and they feel like they need to set a goal. The second stage is someone at our organization set a goal. You know what? Our CEO just went out and said we would be carbon neutral, but we have no idea how the heck we're going to do that. So we need to figure that out now because that's already out there publicly. The third one, and we see this in the data center space, especially in the hyperscalers, they are in a position of maturity, but they're coming up against some type of hurdle or roadblock to get them to their objective. A major one we see is actually in the refrigerant space, where they see that as the last incremental emission that they don't know how to respond to. So they're looking for a very tactical solution to this hurdle that they don't know how they're going to overcome. And within the corporations, there's a varied group of stakeholders. And it's a mix of those that are on the strategic end and the tactical end. The other thing we're seeing from our customer conversations and market scanning is where the pressure lies in an organization right now. So if you are in a more tactical role, or if you are working with a client that is in a more tactical position, and they are telling you, you know what, sustainability is just not important to our company, or we don't know what decarbonization is, we don't really care about it, we're just focused on resilience, the reality is the pressure hasn't snowballed down to them yet. So what we're seeing right now is because of that institutional investor pressure and where that lies and where that comes through, in that upper left hand of this chart where the strategy is being set, the pressure is the greatest to set a strategy around decarbonization. Over time, that pressure is going to be transferred to the more tactical components of the team. The people that are responsible for design and construction, the people that are responsible for retrofits of the facilities, all of that. And the pressure certainly could be there already, but it's just going to intensify over time. The other call out for what we're looking at here is just how complex all of this is in terms of the number of stakeholders that it touches. And this isn't even all inclusive within an organization. To truly transition to low carbon operations, it's an all hands on deck venture for corporations. And I think those that are really diving in to this being core to their business are figuring that out more and more, that it is all hands on deck. All right, so in the data center space, there are 4 main levers that we see to actually go about decarbonizing your operations. The first is that oldest one, which is energy efficiency. The second is the one that I view as being featured at this conference based off what I've seen from some of the other presentations, both that have happened already and are going to happen, which is clean resilience. Moving from fossil fuel dependency for backup to more of a clean solution going forward. The third is refrigerant management, effectively managing how we choose the global warming potential of our refrigerants and then manage the leaks going forward. And then the last one is renewable energy, both on-site and off-site solutions to help green up your portfolio. So as we've talked to the different data center operators that are out there, there's some perspectives that have been shared that we were able to organize here. The first is that our customers are coming to us. Our customers are the squeaky wheel right now because they've gone out and they've set some kind of goal. So they need us to be lower carbon operations going forward. They're looking for information, they're looking for strategy, and they're looking for timelines because ultimately they inherit how you operate in their Scope 3 emissions. The second thing we've heard from the data center space is that we are distributed. We have sites that are all across the country, all across the globe, and we need to know how to pick the right location to start at and what strategies to implement in each of them. If you think back to that e-grid map that I shared at the beginning, if your focus is decarbonization, it's going to take you to a different location than if your focus is energy efficiency, because you have to take into account the emissions intensity of the local grid. So the third one, and this is somewhat newer, I would say last 6 months or so, is a concern around the rising cost of renewable energy. The next slide is going to highlight just how much the data center has led the renewable energy explosion that we have had here. But we're seeing those costs continue to rise as there's supply chain constraints, there's pressures on the market. So especially those that are implementing off-site strategies where they are paying an incremental cost for their renewable energy, they're seeing that incremental cost go up, and they're saying, well, rather than using renewable energy to offset our energy use, is there a way to become more efficient in how we use the energy, and is that a better investment for us? So on the right-hand side here, I highlight a few major tailwinds. You're probably experiencing some of these firsthand with the rising energy cost. I have highlighted in red the Inflation Reduction Act because we're going to come back to that, and I'm going to give you some very meaningful real-time information. So we all know the data center industry is a major contributor and user of electricity within our globe. And you can see there the chart and the tagline at the top. 1% of global energy use comes from the data center industry. 1% is huge. It is massive when you think about it at that kind of scale. But the good news story is if you look at the left-hand side and you look at the leaders for renewable energy purchasing, the first 6 companies that you see listed there, I believe are all in attendance here in San Antonio. If they're not, they probably should be because they're a key part of this industry. But the renewable energy purchasing and development has been led by the data center industry, and they're the ones that have really opened up the market. So a few other spend characteristics to share with you here to go back to some of the topics we hit on already. The first is the CapEx component, specifically of HVAC. When you think about HVAC and you think about working with our industry, 9% of capital cost is typically tied to HVAC. An important consideration, however, as we think about this new world of low carbon operations, that 9% of capital cost is important, but what we're seeing from the hyperscalers is they're starting to come to us and have a different conversation. It's not your 9% of our capital cost, it is you are 9% of the embodied carbon of building a new data center. And we need you to get lower. And we want to collaborate with you. And we want to figure out how to drive this going forward. So that 9% of capital cost, that flip and convo now is, okay, let's get to the table with these major hyperscalers and all others that are in the space that are focused on embodied carbon. And let's take that 9% chunk and figure out how to drive it down. Just to make sure we land that message, embodied carbon is all about what it takes a company like Trane or a company like Cummins or Caterpillar, I saw both of them here, to build the piece of equipment. So we're going to build you a chiller and it's going to be in La Crosse, Wisconsin. They're going to inherit that electric grid that's up there, and we're going to have to find a way to decarbonize our operations. We're going to buy steel that goes into there, copper that goes into there, et cetera, et cetera. All of that builds up the embodied carbon of a product. And now we are seeing the leading organizations ask the question, what's the embodied carbon of this chiller I'm buying? What's the embodied carbon of this generator that I'm buying? It's the equivalent of nutrition facts. You think about going to the store, and now people are starting to look at the calories, and they're starting to ask the questions as they make these decisions. Beyond simply the first cost, they're thinking about it for the life of the piece of equipment. But then on the operational side, certainly HVAC runs 30 to 40% of the typical operating cost, and that runs into both your scope 1 in some cases, but most cases your scope 2 emissions. for what you're accounting for. I'm not going to teach you all about PUE. I assume most in the room could nod their head and could teach me a thing or two about PUE, but we're going to recall it later here as we look into some other areas. But certainly those that are focusing on strategies to drive down their PUE and have an understanding of their portfolio's PUE mix, what they're doing is they're creating the same conversation in a different wrapper for a decarbonization strategy, because that's what PUE is telling us, is where we have opportunities to reduce our emissions. All right, another hand-raising opportunity. Inflation Reduction Act, who is familiar with it? Okay. Got more hands raised on that one. I hope I can teach you a thing or two here. So the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law August 16th of 2022. It was a $430 billion, that's when you put the pinky up there, stimulus package that came from the federal government. Important to our conversation though, $369 billion of that $430 billion is positioned towards energy and climate change, very specifically. And what the Inflation Reduction Act did that we think is really interesting, and I hope you is really interesting, for building operators, it didn't create net new programs. It took existing programs and it threw just kerosene on the fire. That's probably not a good example for this presentation, but it threw tons of money into these already existing programs. So the relevant programs that are existing that the Inflation Reduction Act infused significant capital into is the Investment Tax Credit Program, also known as the ITC. That enables clean energy and storage. And then we have the 179D tax deduction, which enables energy efficiency and electrification. Both of these are enablers of technologies that can decarbonize a data center. So on the clean energy storage side, or the investment tax credit, what happened is it took an existing 24% tax credit and it increased it to 30% going forward for all technologies that fit within the investment tax credit. It also expanded the ITC from a smaller subset of technologies that was mostly dependent on solar to go forward to a much broader set of technologies like energy storage, which I think is going to be really relevant to this crowd here. And that energy storage is both thermal energy storage as well as battery energy storage. The other thing it did is it added two different boosters. It gave you a booster if you are American-made, and there's a percentage breakdown that's really confusing, and I couldn't explain it to you if I tried. But if it is a percentage American-made, you get an additional 10% tax credit. And if it is installed in what is called an energy community, which is a community that is heavily dependent on fossil fuels and has had a coal plant shut down recently, we're sitting in one of them that has had a coal plant shut down recently, you get an additional 10% booster on that tax credit as well. So net, 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 you potentially have an opportunity to get 50% tax credit towards clean energy and storage technologies because of the Inflation Reduction Act. On the other side, we have the 179D tax deduction. This is focused on the built environment. It's focused on driving energy efficiency and electrification. It used to have a breakdown where you could get a parceled out credit for lighting, one for building envelope, and one for HVAC. And to get the entire credit, you had to reduce from a ASHRAE 90.1 or 90.4 in the data center space baseline, you had to be 50% below that historically. The Inflation Reduction Act pulled that down by half. So if you can reduce your efficiency to 25% below the ASHRAE baseline that's out there, you are now eligible for the full tax deduction available from 179D. It also increased the payment from $1.88 per square foot to $2.50 per square foot. So you got increased money for reaching that threshold. And then you had a booster for every point you were above that 25%, up to $5 per square foot. So again, let's use the net here. There is an opportunity to get up to $5 per square foot of a tax deduction to drive energy efficiency projects in existing buildings and in new construction here in the United States. So just to dive a level deeper on the systems and technologies that have money available to them, on the clean energy storage side, solar has been around for a while in terms of accessing the investment tax credit. Ground source heat pumps are now a specific call out. Combined heat and power, again, our friends at Cummins and Cat can certainly talk to you about that, I'm sure. Then we have the battery storage systems and the thermal energy storage systems. And the red box at the bottom is pretty important because we're all aware of the supply chain issues that we're through right now. In order to get the full tax credit based on the current IRA filings, you have to have a project completed by December 31st, 2024. We're going to blink, and it's going to be hard to complete that because of the supply chain issues that exist out there. So something that's going to come to a head here in the next 12 months, certainly. On the 179D side, it's looking at HVAC and domestic hot water, lighting, building envelope, and then how you control and optimize those systems. I'll say this, the 179D is interesting, but the investment tax credit is much more compelling to the data center space, just because of the way that it operates. To give you an illustrative example to drive this home, if we go on the investment tax credit and we think about a $5 million project to do solar plus battery, and it receives a 40% ITC, you're getting $2 million of that to go directly against the project costs because there's a tax credit. So it is going to buy down the project by 40%. If we go on the 179D side, this is a deduction that's going to go against your corporate income for your taxes. And if you're taking, in this example, it's a 200,000 square foot co-location facility, and you're doing a complete retrofit, in this scenario, you're looking at $600,000 in a tax deduction that you can get to enable that deep retrofit at the facility. All right, so the last section here, we're going to spend about 5-10 minutes on, and then I'm going to open the floor for questions. So some of the people that have been calling us are these ESG investment funds. And it's been a very interesting approach. It goes back to these solar developers. And what they're doing is they're coming to Trane and saying, hey, y'all got any of them data center customers? And we're like, yeah, we got some data center clients that we work with. They're like, well, we want to buy them new equipment. And we're like, okay, that's interesting. Tell us more. So we've been really looking to unravel why the ESG investment community is looking to invest in HVAC and other technologies for the data center space. And there's these ESG funds that have been raised by making commitments to the sustainability outcomes that they will drive. So they're out there, and the money's been raised already to the tunes of billions and trillions of dollars. And they are looking to deploy this capital into projects that can meet the goals of how they raise their money. So they see the data center space, and they see decarbonization as an absolute sweet spot for them, and it creates a compelling opportunity for all of us. To level down on that just a little bit, what makes the data center interesting to these investors? Certainly the scale of the industry. The size of these projects dwarf what they would be looking to do if they called on a McDonald's or a JCPenney or some customer like that. The fact that your industry frankly cares and has drank the Kool-Aid on this for the most part. You understand the outcomes that can be driven by decarbonization. Most of the corporations, especially the hyperscalers, are out there with net zero goals. They're out there with net zero teams, and they're driving this forward. So they see that you care and you understand the business case beyond simply energy savings. There are other elements as well that change the calculations completely. And then the third's an important one, especially post-COVID, it's health of the industry. These investments have long-term paybacks. So they're looking to go to an industry that they're comfortable is going to be here in 10, 15, 20 years. if I use those previous examples, they don't have the same comfort level. So an ESG is going to make money by taking the risk from you and doing a job, be it putting in a chiller or doing solar, whatever it might be, and then finding the most efficient path to drive some kind of outcome that they're going to sell you. And I'm going to give you a breakdown of how this works, and it ultimately works towards the as a service for those that are familiar with it. But these ESG investors are seeing an opportunity to drive an investment and drive decarbonization because they see a better path, frankly. So there's a shifting mindset, and we have a trained chiller up there, and we think about how most of you probably think about our chillers, and it's a capital cost, and you have a service contract that you put up against it so that if it ever goes down, you get a tech that's out there right away, and you replace on fail, or maybe when it fully depreciates and it's at the end of useful life. The way the ESG community thinks about this is that chiller can drive a more significant outcome that's tied to decarbonization, that's tied to stockholder value. They can guarantee the performance of that piece of equipment and take that off of your books so that you're not responsible if the chiller does go down. That responsibility lies with someone else to get it repaired and get it back up and running. And then ultimately, it's about investment worthiness. If it's not past the end of useful life, okay, is it still a good investment based on all the information we have in front of us to go ahead and change that out or to drive some other type of project around it? So we're going to walk through just a sample investment scenario to close out here, thinking about a global co-location provider that's rapidly expanding. So they're building out new data centers all across the globe. They recently went public, so ESG is becoming increasingly important to them as their investor relations team tells their story and they hear from this institutional investor community. They have Fortune 50 tenants, so they're hearing from all their stakeholders how this is important. They have an aging infrastructure, and then they have a list of their sites that are PUE outliers. Hopefully some of you are thinking inside and using your internal voice and saying, oh, that sounds like me, or that sounds like my client, because this is a scenario we run into on a regular basis. And in this scenario, what you're looking to do is you're looking to shift the current O&M spend that you have at the facility, develop some investment-grade solutions to shift that spend, and ultimately come up with a scenario that's cash flow positive financing. Meaning that the day that it goes into operations, you are saving more money than you are paying out. So we have boiled this down. I'm going to skip to this slide here. We have boiled this down to just a very simple outlay. There's plenty of pro formas, and we can go a level deeper, and this is an area we can ask questions. But the way that this works in an as-a-service model where you're bringing in a third-party investor to drive some type of initiative is you look at your current spend. And in this customer scenario, over the next 10 years, they know that they're going to be spending $20 million with their local utility on electricity and with their service provider for a piece of equipment. So they're looking at that as a future spend that's going out to those two companies. The way the investor looks at it is don't spend the money with those two companies. Let us go ahead and make the investment, and we will do a service contract with you. We will bundle it all in so that you are not keeping your status quo and maintaining your operations as is. We're willing to invest the capital. We know that your capital is going to your new builds, but we see this as an attractive investment opportunity, so we're going to bring it forward. The right-hand side is how it all lines out at the end for just normalized numbers to not overshare information. What you end up with in this decarbonization scenario is a monthly service contract that bundles everything together, and the monthly service fee that you pay to the investor that actually owns this is less than what you are saving on your O&M. So you are getting net new equipment, you're getting guaranteed outcomes with service contracts behind it. If that piece of equipment ever fails, the investor's on the hook, and they're buying that risk off of you. And then you're getting cash flow positive financing. So I didn't wear my Banana Republic khakis today, so I hope I don't sound too much like that solar developer. But this is starting to reach the very compelling point of, okay, that makes sense. That investment makes sense. And Train's not the one that's actually making this investment. There's plenty of companies that are looking to make the investment. But what we have found to be most compelling for this conversation, and this is my closing slide, is you as a company that's in this space, you're at a critical point. And your critical point is you can either allow someone else to come in and invest in decarbonization in your building, or you're going to do it yourself. So there's a decision to be made, because when we look at the institutional investors and survival is going to require decarbonization, we're either going to bring in this third-party money because we don't have the capital and we're going to let them go to work and we're going to scale this, or we're going to sell it internally because we need that in order to survive and thrive as a company. So that is what I have for today. I will go ahead and open up the floor for questions, and we have 6 minutes and 43 seconds to do so.
So questions for Trevor, please step up to the mic, give your name and company name.
Dave Shiflett, Rowan Digital Infrastructure. Quick question on what defines community to qualify for the ITC?
Yeah, it's an evolving definition right now. There's actually questions that are due to the IRS by November 5th, and that's where most of the energy communities are being defined by. But generally, it's communities where a coal plant has been closed down recently, or communities that has a significant amount of their employment dependent on the fossil fuel industry. So,
thank you.
Yeah, we're hoping to get to a zip code list in about 30 days of where exactly that applies to. Great question, thank you.
Question here.
Brandon Gress, Cupertino Electric. So how is this conversation going for you with your own kind of tier 1, tier 2, your scope 3, when you take the discussion about the quality of the investment, the priority of it? Like, is there a point in your value chain as you get nearer and nearer to raw materials where it's, you're having to educate them about this?
Yeah. As you start to move into the tier 2, the tier 3 kind of suppliers in our space, if I'm understanding your question correctly, it's a very foreign conversation for them. But when we are spending 10, 100, 1,000 million, no, we don't spend 1,000 million with anyone, 10 million, 100 million with those companies, it's a much easier conversation for us to be able to have. And what's happening is we're going to our suppliers and we're going executive to have that discussion, and it quickly drives the conversation. And just to give an example of another industry we see that going really fast in right now, autos. Autos are huge for that because they're going to their tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers. We're seeing companies come out of the works that fabricate car seats that we've never heard of before. And they're like $8 billion companies that are like, we got to figure out this sustainability thing because Toyota's telling us we have to. Next question.
Yeah, hi, it's Carsten Baumann with Schneider Electric.
Hi.
Trevor, thank you so much for the presentation. I like your energy, great stuff. On the ESG side, the funds, is there a minimum and a maximum normally what they like? I mean, if I have a $20,000 upgrade stuff versus a $20 million project, I mean, and where do we find those companies?
Yeah, there is a mix of investment appetite. So we've seen companies, it's normally about $1 million investment threshold for them to take ownership of an asset. But there are companies out there that are looking for $100 million for investment. So our approach is we kind of manage a pool of all of them, and we understand who's willing to do some small RTU changeouts and who's looking to help you build a net zero data center from scratch. Yeah. And I'll give a shout out to the competition. Actually, Schneider's really kind of heavy and leading in this space, and your partnership with Carlyle Group is a great example of as a service.
So I have a question on the screen, Trevor.
Yeah.
What is actually measured in CDP score? Are the A companies the most efficient?
Yeah, so what is measured in CDP scoring is thoroughness of your response. So did you respond to everything in this 90-page questionnaire that's out there? And then from there, it levels into, have you effectively set your baseline, because they do some qualifying data auditing of it, and do you have a plan going forward? Another important component that I didn't reference when that slide was up there, in order to get an A, you have to make your information publicly available. So I'm gonna give you a trade secret, everyone, and Schneider, sorry train team, I'm letting Schneider know. You can go to CDP's website and you can see every company's emissions, you can see their score, and you can see their goals. And they write it out in 90 pages in their own words, what they are committed to going forward. So long and short of it, it's the thoroughness of the response. It's mostly about sharing and disclosing information, and a little bit less about how much have you truly decarbonized at this point.
Trevor, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.